When we talk about breaking generational patterns, we often rush to the part about change. We want the tools, the strategies, the boundaries. But before any of that, there is a quieter, more uncomfortable step: awareness. You cannot transform what you have not first named. And naming a pattern inside your family system can feel like betrayal, because the patterns we inherit are rarely introduced as dysfunction. They are introduced as normal. This is just how we speak to each other. This is just how love looks. This is how conflict is handled. This is how men behave. This is how women endure. This is what strength means. This is what sacrifice requires. These messages are absorbed long before we develop critical thinking. They become the emotional air we breathe. So awareness begins with a radical question. What did I learn about love, power, safety, and worth without realizing I was learning it? Maybe you grew up in a home where emotions were explosive. Anger filled the room quickly and unpredictably. As a child, you learned to scan for tension, to anticipate moods, to shrink or appease. Now, as an adult, you might find yourself either replicating that intensity or avoiding conflict entirely. You call it personality, but perhaps it is inheritance. Or maybe you were raised in silence. Pain was endured privately, problems were minimized, vulnerability was considered weakness. So you learned to function, to cope alone, to dismiss your own needs. You call it independence, but perhaps it is adaptation. Awareness is not about villainizing your parents or your lineage. It is about recognizing that every family passes down both resources and wounds. And here is where psychological maturity becomes essential. Understanding the difference between explanation and excuse. When you begin to see a generational pattern, there is often grief. You realize that some of the behaviors that hurt you were themselves shaped by earlier hurt. Your parents' rigidity may have been born from instability. Their emotional distance may have been forged in trauma. Their control may have been their only strategy for survival. This understanding can soften blame, but it does not eliminate impact. Explanation helps you understand why something happened. It does not require you to tolerate its continuation. This distinction is crucial, because without it, awareness collapses into either resentment or denial. Resentment says, "They ruined me." Denial says, "It wasn't that bad." Neither position creates change. Awareness lives in a more nuanced space. It says, "I see the pattern, I understand where it came from, and I choose not to carry it forward." That choice is powerful. But first, you must identify the pattern clearly. What are the recurring themes in your family story? Financial chaos, emotional unavailability, addiction, overwork, martyrdom, infidelity, silence around mental health, rigid gender roles, chronic criticism. Look not only at dramatic events, but at emotional climates. Was love conditional on performance? Was affection inconsistent? Was anger the dominant language? Was vulnerability mocked or dismissed? Patterns are often less about specific incidents and more about relational tone. And here is something even more subtle. Generational patterns do not only show up in what harmed you, they show up in what you overcorrect. Sometimes the child of chaos becomes obsessed with control. The child of neglect becomes hyper-attuned to others' needs. The child of criticism becomes relentlessly self-demanding. In other words, even your strengths may carry inherited anxiety. Awareness requires courage because it destabilizes identity. It forces you to question whether certain traits are authentic expressions of who you are, or protective strategies you developed to survive your environment. This is not about rejecting your family. It is about seeing clearly. When you can observe a pattern without immediately defending it or condemning it, you create psychological distance, and distance creates choice. Without awareness, you react. With awareness, you respond. You begin to notice moments in real time. You hear your tone rising in a familiar way. You feel the urge to shut down during conflict. You recognize the reflex to overextend yourself to avoid disapproval. And instead of saying, "This is just who I am," you pause and ask, "Is this mine or is this inherited?" That pause is revolutionary because generational patterns persist through automation. They operate below consciousness. Once illuminated, they lose some of their inevitability. But awareness also requires compassion toward yourself. When you recognize that you have been repeating something painful, shame can surface. You may judge yourself for not seeing it sooner, for passing it into your own relationships, perhaps even to your own children. Shame, however, freezes growth. Compassion allows movement. You were shaped before you were self-aware. You adapted before you had options. The goal is not to punish yourself for inherited behavior. It is to interrupt it now that you see it. Breaking generational patterns is not a dramatic rebellion. It is a conscious refusal to remain unconscious. It begins quietly, internally, by telling the truth about what was normalized, by separating love from harm, by honoring resilience without romanticizing dysfunction. Awareness is the first fracture in the cycle. You do not have to destroy your history to change your future, but you do have to look at it honestly. Because what remains unnamed remains repeated. And the moment you can say, "This stops with me," you are no longer just surviving your inheritance, you are transforming it. Once you begin to see the pattern, the next challenge is far more destabilizing: differentiation. Awareness allows you to name what was inherited. Differentiation asks you to decide who you are separate from it. And this is where loyalty becomes complicated. Because for many of us, belonging was built on similarity. We were praised for mirroring values, attitudes, even emotional responses. We learned, often unconsciously, that closeness meant sameness. To question the system felt like distancing ourselves from the people who raised us. So when you start to outgrow a generational pattern, you may feel guilt before you feel freedom. If your family equated love with sacrifice, choosing boundaries can feel selfish. If emotional stoicism was a badge of strength, expressing vulnerability can feel weak. If endurance was glorified, walking away can feel like betrayal. This is not just psychological, it is relational. Families operate as systems. When one person changes, the equilibrium shifts, and systems resist disruption. Differentiation is the ability to remain connected while being distinct. It is saying, "I can love you and not live like you." This is profoundly difficult, because when you shift your behavior, you are no longer playing the role that stabilized the family dynamic. If you were the peacemaker, what happens when you stop smoothing over conflict? If you were the achiever who brought pride to the family name, what happens when you choose a quieter path? If you were the caretaker, what happens when you stop overfunctioning? Others may react, not necessarily with hostility, but with confusion, subtle criticism, or emotional withdrawal. Sometimes the message is explicit. You've changed. Sometimes it's quieter, a tone, a look, a withdrawal of approval. And this is where differentiation becomes courage. Because the temptation will be to shrink back into the familiar role just to restore harmony. We often underestimate how powerful the need for belonging is. Evolutionarily, exclusion meant danger. So when growth threatens belonging, the nervous system reacts. But differentiation is not abandonment, it is integration. You are not rejecting your family. You are refusing to unconsciously reenact what no longer aligns with you. This requires a redefinition of loyalty. Loyalty is often confused with replication. We assume that to honor our parents, we must repeat their choices. But true loyalty can also mean evolution. It can mean taking the resilience they passed down and applying it differently. If your parents survived hardship through emotional suppression, perhaps your loyalty is in honoring their strength while choosing emotional openness for yourself. If your family prized endurance in unhealthy relationships, perhaps your loyalty is in valuing commitment while also valuing dignity. You are not required to inherit every strategy simply because it was once necessary. Differentiation also involves internal separation. You begin to notice the internalized voices that sound like authority, the phrases that echo from childhood, the rules that feel absolute. You don't quit. Don't air family business. Be grateful. Keep the peace. Don't make it about you. Some of these rules contain wisdom, others contain fear. Differentiation is the ability to evaluate them consciously. Does this belief serve the life I am building? Does this value align with my integrity? Is this principle rooted in love or in survival? Without differentiation, awareness alone can create paralysis. You see the pattern, but you feel trapped by obligation. With differentiation, you reclaim authorship. And authorship comes with discomfort. You may have to tolerate temporary misunderstanding. You may have to endure being labeled difficult, dramatic, ungrateful, too sensitive, too ambitious, not ambitious enough. Growth rarely fits neatly into old narratives. But here is something essential. Differentiation does not require aggression. You do not have to reject your origins to redefine yourself. You can hold gratitude and boundaries at the same time. You can acknowledge what your family gave you while refusing what harmed you. This balance is mature. It is not reactive rebellion. It is intentional evolution. And often differentiation deepens respect over time. Because when you stop operating from resentment or compliance, your choices become grounded. You are not pushing away. You are standing firmly. There is also a profound internal relief that comes with differentiation. When your identity is no longer fused with inherited expectations, you breathe differently. Decisions become clearer. You stop seeking unconscious permission. You begin to say, "This is what feels aligned for me," without immediately scanning for approval. That freedom is not selfish. It is responsible, because unexamined loyalty perpetuates patterns. Conscious differentiation interrupts them. And here is the paradox. The more securely you differentiate, the more authentically you can connect. When you are not performing a role to maintain belonging, your presence becomes real. Your love becomes chosen, not obligated. Your relationships become mutual, not enmeshed. Breaking generational patterns is not about cutting ties. It is about cutting unconscious ties. It is about transforming inherited loyalty into conscious choice. And that choice may feel lonely at first, but it is also liberating. Because you are no longer living someone else's unfinished story. You are writing your own, without erasing where you came from. And that is the quiet power of differentiation. You can stay connected, you can stay compassionate, but you no longer have to stay the same. And then we arrive at the part that determines whether all of this reflection actually changes anything. Embodiment. Insight is powerful. Awareness is liberating. Differentiation is courageous. Emotional maturity is transformative. But none of it breaks a generational pattern unless it becomes lived behavior. Because families don't change through intention alone. They change through repetition of new actions. You can understand your family's history of emotional suppression and still avoid difficult conversations. You can recognize a lineage of overwork and still sacrifice your health for approval. You can see the pattern of conditional love and still seek validation through performance. Embodiment is where theory meets friction. It is choosing the boundary and holding it, not once, but consistently. It is communicating differently even when the old tone is easier. It is refusing to participate in gossip, criticism, or emotional manipulation, even if that means sitting in silence. Embodiment is quiet, it is steady, it is often invisible to outsiders, but it is powerful, because over time, behavior reshapes expectation. If your family is used to you absorbing everyone's emotions, the first time you say, "I can't take this on," it may be dismissed. The second time, it may be challenged. The third time, it begins to register as a new reality. Consistency communicates seriousness. And this is where breaking generational patterns becomes less about resistance and more about modeling. You are not simply avoiding what harmed you, you are demonstrating what health looks like. If criticism was normal, you practice affirmation. If silence was default, you practice honest dialogue. If love was transactional, you practice unconditional presence. If chaos was constant, you practice stability. This is not performance, it is integration. Embodiment also means tolerating the lag between your change and others' recognition of it. You may do the work internally and still be treated as the version of you that existed years ago. Families tend to update slowly. They often relate to who you were at 15, not who you are at 35. This can be frustrating, but embodiment does not depend on validation. You do not behave differently so others immediately adjust. You behave differently because it aligns with who you are becoming. And over time, something subtle shifts. People recalibrate. Children absorb the new tone. Partners respond to the new boundary. Even if some resist, the emotional atmosphere changes because you are no longer reinforcing the old pattern. Breaking generational cycles becomes generational when those who come after you inherit something different. If you are a parent, embodiment is particularly profound. Children learn less from lectures and more from observation. They watch how you handle stress, how you argue, how you apologize, how you treat yourself. If you say, it's important to rest, but never rest, the pattern continues. If you say, it's okay to feel, but shame emotion, the cycle remains intact. Embodiment demands congruence. Your words and your behavior must align, and this alignment is deeply regulating, not just for others, but for you. When you consistently act in accordance with your values, self-trust grows, identity stabilizes, the internal fragmentation between what you believe and what you do begins to close. There is also humility in embodiment. Because you will not do it perfectly, you will slip into old tones, you will overreact, you will sometimes avoid. The difference now is that you repair. Repair is part of the new pattern. Where there was once defensiveness, you offer accountability. Where there was once denial, you offer acknowledgement. Where there was once distance, you offer reconnection. Repair teaches something powerful, that mistakes do not equal rupture. Many generational patterns are rooted in unaddressed rupture, in conflicts never resolved, apologies never offered, hurts never validated. When you practice repair, you model resilience. You demonstrate that relationships can stretch without breaking. Embodiment also means expanding your environment. Sometimes breaking a pattern requires finding spaces that reinforce the new behavior. Therapy, community, friendships that normalize vulnerability and accountability. Mentors who embody what you aspire to practice. You cannot expect to live differently while immersing yourself exclusively in the old emotional ecosystem. Growth needs reinforcement. And here is the deeper philosophical layer. When you embody a new pattern, you are altering the narrative of your lineage. You are saying, this is where the story changes. Not with dramatic rebellion, not with condemnation, but with deliberate, repeated action. You become the inflection point. And that is a profound responsibility, but also a profound freedom. Because you realize that history is influential, but not deterministic. What was modeled to you shaped you. It did not seal you. Embodiment is the proof. It is the evidence that inheritance can be transformed into intention. And perhaps the most powerful realization of all is this: you may never receive acknowledgement for breaking the cycle. There may be no applause, no public recognition, no clear marker that says the pattern has ended. But one day you will notice something subtle. A conversation that remains calm, a boundary that is respected, a child who expresses emotion without fear, a relationship that feels safe rather than tense, and you will realize this is new. This did not exist before. Breaking generational patterns is not about rewriting the past. It is about redefining what becomes normal from this point forward. And that happens not in grand gestures, but in daily choices. So as you leave here, ask yourself, what will I practice repeatedly enough that it becomes the new inheritance? Because cycles do not end with awareness alone. They end when someone decides to live differently, long enough for different to become familiar. The challenge is that inherited reactions feel authentic. They feel like, this is just how I am. But often they are rehearsed survival strategies. When someone criticizes you and you immediately shut down, is that personality? Or is it the child who learned that disagreement led to humiliation? When you feel responsible for everyone's comfort, is that generosity? Or is it the legacy of growing up where conflict was dangerous? When you explode during tension, is that strength? Or is it what you witnessed modeled as power? Emotional maturity begins with the pause, and the pause is not passive. It is active self-regulation. It is noticing the surge of anger and choosing not to discharge it immediately. It is feeling the pull toward avoidance and choosing to stay in the conversation. It is sensing guilt when you set a boundary and not retracting it to restore comfort. This is difficult because your body will argue with you. Your nervous system prefers familiarity over growth. Even if the pattern is unhealthy, it is known. It has a script. Breaking it requires tolerating internal discomfort without externalizing it. That is emotional adulthood. Instead of saying, this is who I am, you begin to say, this is what I learned. That shift alone creates distance. And in that distance, you gain agency. Agency is the ability to respond instead of react. Reacting is fast, automatic, emotionally charged. It is shaped by history. Responding is deliberate, grounded, reflective. It is shaped by intention. Responding does not mean suppressing emotion. It means metabolizing it. If anger arises, you explore it rather than weaponize it. If sadness surfaces, you express it rather than numb it. If fear appears, you acknowledge it rather than control others to quiet it. This is the work of emotional regulation, the ability to experience feeling without being dominated by it. And here is what makes this generational. When you regulate yourself, you alter the emotional climate of your relationships. Imagine a family where conflict has always escalated. Voices rise quickly, blame circulates, conversations end abruptly. Now imagine one person choosing to lower their tone, to listen before responding, to articulate their hurt without accusation. The dynamic shifts. It may not shift immediately. Others may continue their familiar responses. But you have introduced a new possibility into the system. Breaking generational patterns is not about controlling others. It is about modeling alternatives, and modeling requires consistency. Emotional maturity is not proven in one successful conversation. It is demonstrated over time, in repeated moments of choosing calm over chaos, clarity over criticism, boundaries over resentment. It also requires accountability. Part of emotional adulthood is the ability to say, "I was wrong," to apologize without defensiveness, to repair instead of justify. If you grew up in an environment where apology equaled weakness, this will feel unnatural. But repair is strength. It communicates safety. It interrupts cycles of shame and blame. There is also a profound shift that happens internally when you stop attributing your reactions solely to others. Instead of, "You made me angry," it becomes, "I felt anger." Instead of, "You're too sensitive," it becomes, "I see you're hurt." This language matters because it reflects ownership. Ownership is power. When you own your emotional experience, you stop perpetuating the pattern of projection, the habit of assigning your internal discomfort to someone else's behavior. This does not mean tolerating mistreatment. It means separating stimulus from response. Someone may behave poorly, but how you respond is your authorship. And authorship is what ends cycles. Breaking generational patterns is not dramatic. It is disciplined. It happens in therapy rooms, yes, but more often it happens in kitchens, in living rooms, in text messages, in tense pauses. It happens when you choose to ask a question instead of make an accusation, when you validate instead of dismiss, when you stay present instead of storming out. These choices may feel small, but over time, they redefine what is normal. And that is the true revolution. You are not erasing your family history. You are evolving it. You are taking inherited emotion and refining it into conscious response. That is maturity. And here is the truth. You will not do it perfectly. You will slip into old reactions. You will catch yourself mid-pattern. You will feel the pull of familiarity. But every time you pause, every time you choose differently, you weaken the old pathway and strengthen a new one. Generational cycles are maintained through repetition. They are broken through interruption. And the interruption begins within you. You cannot rewrite the past, but you can regulate the present. And in doing so, you change the emotional inheritance of the future. The cycle ends not with anger, not with blame, but with a pause, long enough to choose differently.